Lake Zero from compassion fatigue. "Detonate!" Zared screamed into the radio mic, but Yolande wasn't listening anymore. When he released the mic button, her flat voice just continued uttering nonsense. "New constellations, stars in perfect symmetry, they're growing brighter. It's dawn. It won't be dawn for months, for Christ's sakes. Detonate, detonate now!" All the new suns. Behind Yolande's drone, Zared heard the screeching. It was unmistakable once you'd heard it before. Satellite-targeted anti-personnel missiles. "Detonate!" Zared screamed for the last time, but when he listened again, her signal was dead, and he knew the time had come to blow up the lake. Radio security procedure had become lax after Edmonton was bombed, and Zared grew familiar with his counterpart at Great Bear Lake during the long hours when the radio channel had to be kept open. Zared had listened to Yolande intently as they stood watch over their lakes through the endless Arctic nights. Her voice, even her lilting Quebecois accent, was uncannily like those of his wife, Celine, whose voice he would never hear again. Zared didn't think Yolande was the right type to be a terminal option officer. Despite everything she'd been through, she still dared hope for a better future. When she was a mathematics professor in Montreal, the government of the République shut down McGill to quell the conscription riots. Then her husband, a robot programmer, lost his job when the Honda plant he worked at shut down in 1929. This left him with the same choice as every other unemployed man under the age of 30. Conscription for the Indigenous Wars, or immigration somewhere where he could earn enough to pay the exemption tax. He was allowed to sign on for a job in the Acadia Free Trade Zone, provided Yolande remained in Quebec. She never saw him again. Industrial accident was the cause given on the death certificate they mailed her with the ashes, but she figured the cause of death was breach of contract. He couldn't stomach the fast, loose kind of industry practiced in the AFTZ, and wanted to come home, even if it meant doing his service. They granted him his release, but while signing a union card in the parking lot of an Amazon fulfillment center, he and the union organizer were shot dead by security drones. His death politicized Yolande, and she fled north to free Canada. Now she was dead too, delivered from her terrible duty by a foot-long SAP cruise missile packing a kilo of fuel-air explosive. Zared stuck his head out of the trench and looked hopefully towards the northern horizon for the flash that would tell him that Yolande had done her duty before she died. No flash, not even a glow, like a distant city or the aurora borealis. He checked the seismograph. The line was flatter than Saskatchewan. In the final moments of her life, Yolande must have loved her lake more than her country. It would now be in American hands. After their special forces had secured the field, their corps of engineers would move in and pump the lake into the aqueduct network that ended in California. By anyone's estimate, it was only 372 days worth of fresh water for them. Great Slave Lake would be another 296 days worth. But they won't get it, thought Zared, not over my dead body. He returned to the dugout and picked up the detonation unit. It was an aluminum box the size of a two-slice toaster. On top of it was a short rubber antenna, and on the front was a key switch, an amber light, a red light, and 2 red buttons. The buttons were far enough apart and spring-loaded so that the thumbs of both hands had to be used in order to depress them. Between the 2 buttons, Zared had taped his only picture of Celine. Once the key was turned and the amber light came on to show the device was armed, if both buttons were held down for 5 seconds, the red light came on. If the buttons were held down for another 3 seconds, 2 50-megaton warheads from surplus Russian SS-20 missiles would go off in a shipping container filled with cobalt mining slag at the bottom of the lake, turning one of the last significant bodies of usable fresh water in the world into radioactive steam. Zared inserted his key and turned it. The amber light came on. Then he heard footsteps in the trench. He put the detonation unit down and grabbed his rifle. When Suho entered the dugout, Zared recognized him in time not to blow his head off. "Lose it," Zared snapped, and Suho dropped his own rifle. "What are you doing here?" Zared lowered his rifle, but kept the muzzle leveled at Suho's solar plexus. Suho was 22 and one of the youngest members of the unit. He and his family had moved to Vancouver from Hong Kong in 27 and were interned in 28 during the Sino-Subcontinental conflict. Suho joined the resistance after he was liberated from the Prince George Refugee Preservation Center. I just wanted to know if it was true that Great Bear had fallen," Suho said breathlessly, his face a naked display of fear. The exhibit of emotions struck Zared as obscene. Suho should control himself and feel only what he needed to feel in order to function. Knowing that both he and Suho would soon be dead anyway, Zared hoped he wouldn't have to shoot him. "Suho, you know you're not supposed to bring a weapon in here. I could kill you." Suho suddenly remembered procedures and realized how close he had come to being killed. "I'm sorry. It's just I heard that Great Bear had fallen, and I knew that's when you..." Zared's right index finger tensed on the trigger. The nickel had dropped for Suho, and he might not be able to deliver the goods. "Get out of here," Zared told him tersely. But what, Suho?" "We gave them the gas, we gave them the wood, we farmed ourselves into a desert to feed their slaughter in Asia, and we rerouted every clean river south. Now they want whatever standing water it isn't as a cesspool yet. Does it stop somewhere, Suho, or do we just lie down and forget we ever had a country?" Suho examined Zared with frightened eyes. "But sir, this is the last lake." Zared shouldered his rifle. "And it's a beautiful lake, Suho, clean and pure as anything that's left in this sewer of a world. That's why I'm going to turn it into a cloud and let it fly away free. Now get back to your station, Suho, and don't come back in here, or I promise I'll kill you." Suho slowly bent to pick up his rifle. "Leave the rifle, Suho." Suho straightened up and started walking backwards. "God bless you, Suho," Zared said under his breath. Without taking his eyes off Zared, Suho backed out of the dugout. Zared had seen a treacherous desperation to live in the young fighter's eyes and dropped to one knee, keeping his weapon aimed at the dugout opening. His suspicions were confirmed seconds later when Suho rushed into the dugout holding an old bullet-firing automatic. He had expected to catch Zared by surprise, but the older man fired a 2-second burst from his flechette rifle before Suho even got off a shot. 78 flechettes pierced Suho's chest and abdomen, destabilizing on penetration and churning through his body cavities. By the time he hit the floor, his organs, muscles, and nerves were pulp. Zared didn't move for a minute, in case other members of the unit were of a mind with Suho. When he felt assured that Suho was acting alone, he lowered his rifle, hung his head, and closed his eyes. When he opened his eyes again, he forced himself to look at Suho's face. Mercifully, it registered no pain, just astonishment. Zared knelt beside the dead fighter. "Stupid fool," he said gently, and closed the startled eyes with his thumb and forefinger. Zared had never had to kill one of his own people. A political officer got that chore when it was necessary, and it felt alien and terrible. Killing probably should feel this way, he thought, but it hasn't for a long time. He let his hand rest on Suho's face and was surprised to find himself about to cry. Suddenly, his conditioning cut in. He shuddered and stood up abruptly. "I am an officer of the final option. I have lost all things once cherished, and am sustained in life by the necessary hatred for the oppressor of my land. I accept the sacred trust of defending my country, even should I be required to scorch its beloved earth in order to deny it to mine enemy." Zared picked up the detonation unit and held it with both hands. He was ready. Any last requests? He asked himself ironically. His answer to himself was that he wanted one last look at the lake. He knew this was both dangerous and a flagrant violation of procedure, but his fear of death had died with Celine, and he knew that his only judge would be history. He picked up his rifle, and grasping the detonation unit with his free hand, he left the dugout. Stepping into the dark trench, Zared saw the gunner Simon on his knees in front of his dual Vulcan guns, praying. Simon had surely seen Suo entering the dugout and heard the gunfire. Zared aimed his rifle at Simon as he passed, but Simon, deep in prayer, didn't even acknowledge his presence. Zared heard familiar but anomalous sounds as he rounded a corner. He moved cautiously, rifle ready. In the darkness, he made out fighters Joshua and Astrid, partially clothed, having sex against the side of the trench. An hour ago, they hadn't even liked each other, Zared thought. As he passed them, he saw dirty tears running down their faces as they sought to lose themselves in one last futile act of lust. Around the next corner, Zared encountered a fighter named Oswald, who was at his station, keeping watch over the landscape above the trench. He was wearing a set of wireless earphones, which he removed hurriedly when he saw Zared. Oswald shoved the earphones hurriedly into his pocket, but Zared could hear Bruce Coburn's "Call It Democracy" emanating from the two buds. Oswald was puzzled to see Zared in the open trench, pointing a rifle at him. "Something wrong, sir?" Oswald asked. Zared hesitated, then lowered the rifle. The Coburn song was churning up emotions in him. Celine had been a fan of Coburn. Her favorite song had been "Lovers in a Dangerous Time." She would sing it anywhere she was, despite the ban on his music imposed by the Quisling Parliament. "Nothing wrong, fighter. But you know better than to wear earpods on watch." "I'm sorry, sir. It's just the night's so long and I get tired. The music helps me keep my watch, sir." "Yes, I suppose it does," Zared said. "But get back to your position and turn the music down. You'll want to hear if you get shot." The young fighter smiled. "Yes, sir." Zared managed to smile back briefly to set the young man at ease. Then he continued down the trench, choking down the emotions he had denied ever having for so long. As he clambered up the side of the trench, he remembered rock climbing with Celine in Algonquin Park. It was before the free trade agreement, the separation, the stolen election, the coup, and the invasion. Celine had been as fearless in her attacks at the rock faces as she would later be in her attacks on the policies of the Quisling Parliament. Zared used to watch her climb and was forever cautioning her against the folly of such a dangerous sport. She was 25 when they came for her. They were in bed when they heard the trucks pull up outside. It was August, and they were entangled in sheets soaked with the sweat of their lovemaking. The window was open, and the footsteps on the stairs was intermingled with the tinkling music from an ice cream truck. She knew what was coming and put her pistol into his hand. She had never fired it, and knew it was no match for the weapons of the soldiers on the stairs. She looked straight at Zared and asked him to kill her. But he couldn't do it. She put her hands over his and pleaded with him as she gently pressed his finger into the trigger and pulled the barrel up against her heart. Then the door crashed in, and his world exploded with a flash and a bang. He was shot and left for dead. She was disappeared. What happened to her was anybody's guess. Probably a variation of what every disappeared person endured from the perfection of the practice in the 1970s in South America. Dehumanization at the hands of some School of America's trained specialist before being dropped into the ocean from a helicopter or ground up for pig feed behind a factory farm. At the top of the trench, the nightmare of Zared's memory receded in view of the primordial beauty of Great Slave Lake. The moon was full, and its reflection reached the horizon, broken only by floes of the purest white ice. The water was ink black and rippled beneath the caress of the spring wind. In the distance, the lake met the sky. The deepest black fabric hung heavy stars. As Zared's eyes drank in the beauty, he was overwhelmed with serenity. His eyes, brutalized by inhumane cities, man-made deserts, clear cuts, and moonscapes of garbage, were awed by scenes of the most basic natural beauty, such as a stand of trees or a field of prairie grass. The lake was of an order of beauty beyond anything he had experienced before arriving in that place. He would have done his duty then, grateful for the privilege of feasting his senses on such creation, but something in the vista troubled him, and he hesitated. He tried to regain some perspective as he searched the panorama of lake and sky for the source of his unease. His gaze settled, finally, on an unfamiliar constellation. Its stars patterned in 3 rows of 6, perfectly equidistant from each other. The memory of Yolande's death ramblings about symmetrical constellations came back to him, and his heart started hammering in his chest. He threw down his rifle and hit both buttons on the detonation unit with his thumbs. The stars in the constellation grew brighter. He started counting, praying he was still in time. 1. The orbital mirrors vectored, and 18 small suns grew in the sky until the landscape was bathed in blazing reflected daylight. 2. About 20 meters away, Oswald emerged from the trench, his left hand shielding his eyes. He looked completely perplexed. 3. Oswald's expression became one of terror when he saw Zared holding the detonation unit with both hands. 4. A small missile dropped out of the sky 200 meters behind Oswald. When it was 5 meters from the ground, 2 stubby wings popped out of its body and it fired its propellant. Emitting a deafening screech, it accelerated towards Oswald level with his waist. Zared yelled to Oswald, who squinted and pulled the earphone from his left ear. 5. Zared combated his reflex to take his hands for the detonation unit to indicate the danger to Oswald. He controlled himself and did nothing as a missile took out the young fighter, leaving a 10-meter-long patch of burning ground and a cloud of greasy smoke. 6. The explosion blew Zared back into the trench, but his hands were clamped on the detonation unit. When he opened his eyes, he saw that the red light was on. He stood up and blew the dirt from the picture of Celine. The sight of her even then made him smile. 7. The screech of missiles came from every direction now. Several missiles entered the trench system, following it until they met flesh. The trenches erupted in fire. The news of the new water was met in California with rejoicing. In celebration of the near bloodless victory, rationing was lifted in the state for 2 days. Fire hydrants were opened in the heat of the day for children to play in, and people bathed shamelessly in the streets. Civic fountains were activated, but quickly shut down when anti-war protesters dyed the water red. A protester in San Isidro was caught in the act of desecrating water in this way and was ripped to pieces by a mob before the police arrived. The president, a former New York real estate tycoon, appeared on television and asked that every American who enjoyed a glass of water that day say a prayer for the brave American soldiers and the generous, freedom-loving peoples of the United Canadian Trade Zones that made that drink possible. He also promised that as soon as the insurgency in Canada was quelled and the uprising in Brazil was under control, work would resume on the Northwest Green Network, a chain of 47 nuclear-powered desalination plants along the coast from Portland to San Diego. When the 2-day water holiday was nearly over, people filled up every container they could get their hands on before settling back into the rationing regime, secure in the knowledge that for 1 more year, no citizen of means need no thirst.